Mr. Nirav Patel, co-founder of the Asia Group, joins me on India Sense. Mr. Patel, thanks so much for taking out the time and speaking to me, speaking to NDTV. My first question to you, sir, we speak at a time when India is celebrating its 78th Independence Day. I want to ask you this, that as we crystal ball gaze and look towards the future, how do you view India's journey to 2030 from here on?
Look, I think it's a pleasure to have this chance to be able to speak during a very important period in India's both history as a way to reflect on significant achievements, but most importantly, as you know, to really think about what the moment in time means for India. And from an economic perspective, I think India is sitting at the beginning phases of a very significant economic super cycle that not only is about inward investments that are flowing into India at a much higher basis, but also as it relates to hitting critical economic development objectives that are front and center of course, not only the political leadership, but the day-to-day lives of the Indian people. On the other hand, on a geopolitical basis, it's clear as observers of India that its role and influence on critical global matters continues to increase. So as I look at 2030, in many ways, it really is the moment in time where I think people will look back at conversations that have been happening for the last 2 to 3 decades and really be able to identify clear markers that represent the role and critical influence that India will be able to project globally in 2030 and onwards.
Mr. Patel, there are two trends that are happening simultaneously. There is a growing India and there's also a slowing China. How do you see these two trends, especially in the context of India's role and rise in Asia?
Look, I think there's a popular misconception that China's economic malaise is in some instances good for India or good for the global economy from a geopolitical perspective. The reality is that China's economy and its economic performance are fully intertwined with the well-being of the global macroeconomic environment. So when Chinese consumers lose confidence, when Chinese consumers aren't buying as much product, when manufacturing declines, et cetera, it creates ripple effects around the world. So in some instances, I think it's important to be able to recognize that a healthy Chinese economy in many instances is very important to the global economic outlook, as well as, of course, for India. But that being said, when it comes to the current geopolitical environment, there are clearly certain sectors that are going to have a very difficult time from a global or Western perspective to continue to invest into the Chinese market. And that's not only because of the policies of governments like the United States, but it's also because of policies that are underway in China itself. And that, I think, creates a geopolitical opportunity for India that effectively is about creating arbitrage value based on geopolitics that starts to drive those types of investments in sectors like semiconductors, electric vehicles, et cetera, into a market like India that, of course, has very significant consumer demographic opportunities that are generating very significant tailwinds, as well as a policy environment that continues to be conducive to the type of large-scale investments that we've not only observed with companies like Apple, but of course, there's a number of those businesses that are thinking very aggressively about where to deploy significant pools of capital, how to take advantage of government policy schemes like PLI that really are meant to create the incentive pathway and pipeline for those companies that are thinking about a so-called +1 strategy, where they are not only wanting to maintain some degree of presence and positioning in China, but beginning to explore ways to not only diversify from a supply chain risk management perspective, but also where is that next critical market going to be that will enable the type of economic performance that these companies need. And the only other economy left in the world that has the size and scale from a consumer as well as macroeconomic opportunity perspective is India at this juncture. So, I'm both bullish on it, but at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that there are two distinct pathways that one needs to think about when it comes to how to capture the value that exists from global investments into China that could find their way into India, but at the same time, not be too enamored in the concerns of how do you seek opportunity from Chinese economic malaise? Because once again, I think in that juncture, there is risks that are also prospectively creating headwinds for economies like India as well as the United States.
What do you think will be the next phase of India's growth? Do you think it will be driven more by manufacturing, or do you think it will be more driven by AI and tech? How do you see that?
Well, look, I think candidly, the manufacturing story is something that is in the beginning phases of being seen in terms of how quickly can India attract the type of global manufacturing capability that it aspires to attract. And the reality is there's a number of economies, whether in Vietnam or in Thailand or Mexico, that are all gunning for those same type of manufacturing investments. And you're right to point out that Indian policies that are meant to attract that are making India a competitive destination for manufacturing. But if I were to make a bigger bet on the drivers of India's economic future, I think the high technology sector will continue to be an area where there is definitional as well as defining characteristics that separate India from the global pathway of who ends up becoming kind of the victor of the 21st century technology competition arena. And if I look at AI and you look at the depth of programming capability, new set of businesses that are emerging on a daily basis based on the entrepreneurial culture that exists in many pockets of India, I think that's a bet that, in my view, would drive the type of economic acceleration that India aspires. And on the manufacturing side, once again, I think it's a more competitive space. And I think it's yet to be seen in terms of how much India can actually capture, and if that capture occurs at a rate that's both efficient and aligned with the type of aspirations that the government has articulated when it comes to 2030 or well into the future.
And how do you see India's role in the chip race that's currently on? Do you think it'll be a decisive role that India could play in this chip race?
I think the chip side, as you know, is a very complex endeavor. There are a number of companies that have been thinking hard about where to deploy capital to build a new semiconductor fab, what type of technology, what type of specific semiconductor that they want to build in India. And I think the challenge that continues to exist in a continent like Asia is there is a lot of high value consumer electronic manufacturing capacity that exists. And the question that I think a lot of investors in the semiconductor space are looking for is energy, infrastructure, and the offtake that's necessary to justify that type of capital investment. And by that, what I mean is, do you also have a domestic buyer base in India that could create the natural pathway to de-risk what ends up being, of course, $30 to $40 billion investments for specific types of fabs that semiconductor industries would like to build. So just as I noted on the manufacturing story, I think India is in the early innings of trying to capture some of those semiconductor investments. And it's possible that there will be incremental great gains that India is able to achieve before it gets to that end goal of becoming a global source for development as well as manufacturing of higher value and smaller node semiconductor chips that will be a critical part of the AI future going forward. But right now, I think it's still really a matter of seeing the data that would actually support that those global companies that are producing the type of semiconductors in concentrated geopolitical hot zones, if you will, whether or not they're going to start deploying capital in India will be the question that I think many of us as outside of observers will be looking for as an indication of whether or not India factors in as a global state in the geopolitical semiconductor race.
What would you like as the three major shifts in India that could determine and shape its future, both from an economic point of view as well as a larger political or geopolitical point of view?
Look, I think the first is the role of government in ensuring that no matter who's in power, that there's a continuity of focus and effort to embrace the type of enabling policy environment that we have seen for the last decade. And I think that is really at the heart and center of what India needs to do to capture the type of manufacturing trends that we observe globally. And then, of course, associated with those are the job creation aspect that are fundamental to India's future. So the first one is really policy continuity to accelerate areas that are working, to diagnose areas that are not as conducive to the type of investments that India needs to not only maintain its current position, but to lead and accelerate. The second is influence of India on a global basis as the world's largest democracy, as a country that has values that are consistent with countries like the United States and many European countries that are at this point in time fighting to ensure that the critical features of the global system that have benefited most of the global economy continue into the future. And India will have a critical role to play. It'll have its own influence. It'll have its own criteria of how it seeks to shape those international institutions, as it's been doing for decades. But I think going forward, we're likely to see more Indian expeditionary capabilities in terms of its diplomacy, in terms of the use of multilateral institutions that start to create more Indian attributions to the international order. So the second feature is really its role in geopolitics and its ability to influence in world order that has once again been underwritten by liberal internationalism and the role of democracy and the values that those present. And the third is making a bet on the people of India. And I don't think there's a country in the world that represents the dynamism, the intellectual depth, the capacity to be able to innovate and execute and undertake very, very complex problems. And it's not just in the high technology space, it's in biotech, it's in biopharmaceuticals, it's everything that we're seeing emerge associated with DPI. It's seeing a new generation of Indian businesses that are beginning to think and operate on a much more global basis, whether through investments or whether through undertaking the type of internal processes and policies that make them also conducive to the type of M&A boom that we're seeing, and that in many instances being driven by global private equity investors that see India as a very interesting and high velocity growth opportunity for them into the future. But those three trends are the ones that I would look at as being determinants for India's ability to continue to shape the international environment, but most importantly, to drive the type of economic benefits that the people of India need and what the government aspires for the people of India to have.
And lastly, Mr. Patel, as far as the new world order is concerned, do you see India shaping it? How do you see India's role in it going forward?
Look, I think it's going to be a world order in the next 5 to 10 years of struggle, unfortunately, of very significant geopolitical competition. I think we are in the beginning phases of how the United States and China in particular learn to interact under a paradigm of strategic competition, where parameters and guardrails for how to manage and mitigate against very risky elements of competition are being thought about and addressed. Of course, Russia's greater revanchist approach to international affairs is generating very significant volatility, insecurity. We see them trying to exercise that on a global basis. And of course, very significant problems and insecurity based on conflict in the Middle East that creates tremendous amounts of global risk, whether from an energy economic perspective, as well as just from a humanitarian perspective based on the tragedies that we see unfolding in parts of the Middle East. So I think the way that the international order plays out, unfortunately, currently is animated more through struggle and danger as opposed to opportunity. Now, my view is that countries like India, countries like the United States, always have an aspiration and a very unique ability to reinvent themselves. And they reinvent themselves through struggle. And as someone who is a firm believer in what the United States and India can do together, I think a large part of what will change the narrative and the story from struggle to one that embraces opportunity and hope is really going to be defined through democracies working together, figuring out ways to manage competition and unhealthy challenges that exist in the international order. So I'm an optimist, and I think that if the two countries can continue to make the necessary investments, ensure cooperation through the goods and the bads, that we will have a brighter future. And in many instances, the United States, in my view, is very fortunate to count on India to be part of that future, because in the past, of course, there was different views. And I think over the past 2 decades, the governments and the people of India have really recognized that the destiny of our relationship is one that really is about the future and providing the children as well as the people of both countries an opportunity to dig in deeper, to get to know one another, and to do more important things on a global basis.
All right, Mr. Patel, thanks so much for speaking to me and speaking to NDTV. This has been a very enriching conversation as far as India's role and its future going forward.